Have you ever wondered why holiness seems like an impossible mountain to climb? Something distant and abstract that only a select few ever reach? Most people hear about becoming holy and think it's just about trying to act like God or living a life that mirrors Christ's, but the truth is far more intricate and far more personal than that. Holiness isn't just a lofty ideal, it's a real, tangible state that can be cultivated, measured, and even strengthened through the struggles we face every single day. And one of the most overlooked truths about holiness is that spiritual warfare, the very battles we try to avoid or dismiss, is actually the furnace in which our sanctity is forged. Before you can understand how these battles make us holy, you have to first understand what holiness really is. Because without knowing the destination, you can never properly chart a course. Holiness, or sanctity, as the authors of the Church put it before the Second Vatican Council, is not a side goal. It is the end for which the Church exists, the ultimate purpose of our lives, to become holy. And that's why understanding the end is crucial. It allows us to recognize the means. If we don't know what holiness truly is, it's nearly impossible to identify the steps that actually lead to it. Sanctity, at its core, is excellence in grace. But what is grace, specifically? We are talking about sanctifying grace, a real, active quality residing in the soul itself, not just a change in God's perception of us. It is something that qualitatively transforms us, infusing us with participation in the divine nature. It's not abstract, it's tangible in the deepest part of your being, and it changes how God relates to you. Most people confuse God's love for his pleasure. Yes, God loves all of us universally, but there is a distinction between being loved and being pleasing to him. And it is sanctifying grace that makes us pleasing. That initial grace comes through baptism, and if we falter, confession restores it. This grace isn't static. It can grow, expand, and elevate us to higher levels of virtue and holiness. Every human action, every morally good decision taken in the state of grace carries the potential to increase this participation in divine nature. But here's the catch. It requires intention. The action must be deliberate, morally good, and oriented toward a supernatural end, not merely natural benefits or social approval. Consider the saints, like Padre Pio, whose holiness was tangible and profound. His acts carried weight beyond our comprehension because he lived fully in sanctifying grace and acted with supernatural intention. If you had the choice between having Padre Pio offer a mass or an average priest, you instinctively know the answer: there's a real difference. That difference is grace multiplied through intention, through living a life that seeks God first, not merely as an abstract ideal, but as a concrete reality. It's why even prayers, actions, and virtues of the Blessed Virgin Mary had a measurable effect on sanctity. Every act of hers was an increment in holiness, a layering of grace, a building of virtue, done in perfect charity. But holiness is not a simple linear climb. There are degrees, layers, and obstacles. Unlike angels, whose sanctity was fixed after their initial choice, humans have the capacity to grow continually through merit. Each good act, performed in grace, contributes to our spiritual elevation. Conversely, falling into sin diminishes our participation in divine nature, weakening the soul and empowering the adversary. That's where spiritual warfare intersects with holiness. Demons exploit our weaknesses, testing our virtue, probing our defects, and seeking to trap us in sin because they know that in our struggles lie the seeds of our sanctity. Virtue is the measure of our progress. Natural virtues like prudence, temperance, fortitude, and justice perfect our human faculties, giving us a foundation upon which the supernatural virtues infused by God can operate. Charity, prudence, justice, and temperance take on supernatural form when they are oriented toward God, not ourselves. And this is where most people stumble. Even when infused virtues exist in the soul, they remain dormant unless the natural foundation is intact. You cannot exercise the supernatural virtue of temperance without cultivating the natural virtue of restraint, without training the lower faculties to cooperate. Spiritual warfare is precisely the mechanism that forces this cooperation. Demons engage us not only to afflict us, but to reveal our weaknesses, to provoke us into action, and to strengthen our virtues under fire. The trials are calibrated. Too little challenge and the soul stagnates. Too much and the soul risks falling. But God governs it all. Even the most intense demonic afflictions are under his control, designed for our sanctification or, in some cases, to execute divine justice on the adversary. Humans are conscripted instruments of justice in this battle, sometimes unknowingly, sometimes painfully aware. And in this process, the demons themselves become tools of our spiritual advancement, forcing us to exercise fortitude, courage, patience, and unwavering faith in ways that ordinary life rarely demands. The key to understanding holiness is realizing that it's forged in struggle. Most of us are spiritually mediocre, living comfortable lives, unaware of the hidden opportunities for sanctity embedded in every temptation, every confrontation, every moral choice. Even ordinary temptations, magnified by the demonic, serve a higher purpose. They demand engagement, deliberate action, and intentional virtue building. You are not fighting alone. You are being refined in a crucible where every act of goodness, every moment of resistance increases your capacity for holiness. But here's where the story deepens. The demons don't just attack randomly. They test the soul, probing every defect, every vulnerability, every latent vice. They are experts in human psychology, exploiting the same tendencies within us that exist within them, attempting to make us manipulable, to steer us away from grace. The stakes are high because each defect we allow to persist not only blocks our supernatural virtues, but also magnifies the adversary's influence. Yet the paradox is striking. The very forces that seek to destroy us are those that, under God's direction, forge our sanctity, sharpen our virtues, and expand our participation in divine nature. This interplay is not theoretical, it is concrete, practical, and relentless. Every human weakness is an arena for spiritual growth. Every act of justice, fortitude, or charity, a brick in the edifice of holiness. But the challenge is continuous, because the demons exploit our defects precisely to hinder the exercise of higher virtues. Even the smallest vice, anger, pride, sloth, carries a psychological weight, a resonance with diabolic tendencies that makes us vulnerable and slows our sanctification. The work of holiness requires vigilance, self-awareness, and intentional cultivation of virtue in every facet of life, from the simplest act of fasting to the most profound acts of charity. And yet, even as the demons test us, God's mercy and justice interweave seamlessly. Each trial is calibrated, each affliction purposeful. Saints endure not merely because they are stronger than us, but because they cooperate with the grace offered, aligning intention, action, and virtue toward God. And herein lies the secret. Holiness is not an abstract ideal to be admired from afar. It is an attainable state, dynamically forged through struggle, perfected in virtue, and measured by participation in divine nature. Spiritual warfare is not an obstacle. It is the very instrument of your sanctification, the fire in which excellence and grace is forged, preparing you for the fullness of holiness that God intends. This is where most teachings stop, leaving holiness as an abstract goal, a distant aspiration. But understanding the intimate connection between our struggles, our virtues, and our participation in divine nature changes everything. Every temptation becomes a tool, every affliction a lesson, every act of virtue a step closer to God's pleasure. And when you begin to see spiritual warfare not as something to fear, but as the ladder to sanctity, you start to understand why the saints embrace trials, why the devout saw every challenge as a grace-laden opportunity, and why ordinary Catholics can, through intentional action and perseverance, achieve extraordinary holiness. But the question that hangs in the air is this: if holiness is accessible, if sanctifying grace can grow through action and intention, why then do most of us fail to act saintly even when we are in the state of grace? That is where the next layer of truth lies, a truth about the subtle, persistent, and relentless influence of the diabolic, and the ways in which our own defects, weaknesses, and human frailty interact with these forces to shape, test, and ultimately elevate us. And this is where the real story begins, the point where theory meets the battleground of reality, where your participation in divine nature is not just an idea, but a lived, tested, and forged reality that can either rise to holiness or fall short. The demons are never random. Their attacks are precise, measured, and purposeful, probing your weaknesses, your vices, your tendencies towards sin. They exploit psychological compatibilities, mirroring the exact inclinations that exist in your soul. And yet, paradoxically, God uses this same pressure to purify, to strengthen, and to sanctify. Every probe, every temptation, every trial is calibrated to stretch your virtue, to push your will, and to expand your capacity for divine participation. Fortitude, justice, prudence, temperance, each is exercised under fire, becoming operational not in comfort, but in challenge. And this brings us to the threshold of an even deeper revelation. In the interplay of divine justice, mercy, and diabolic opposition, every person engaged in the struggle, whether aware or not, is part of a cosmic process of sanctification. No act is wasted, no moment trivial, no temptation meaningless. Each encounter, each trial, each test is a brushstroke in the portrait of your holiness, and every struggle survived leaves you not weaker, but stronger, more aligned with grace, and more pleasing to God. And yet, even with all this clarity, one question remains, suspended like a knife edge in the narrative. How do you practically engage with this spiritual warfare? How do you recognize the precise virtues to cultivate, the defects to uproot, and the intentions to purify, so that your participation in divine nature grows? How do you navigate the invisible battlefield in a world saturated with sin, temptation, and distraction, ensuring that every struggle becomes an opportunity rather than a setback? That is the crucible we step into next, the place where theory meets practice, where holiness is no longer a distant abstraction but a tangible, lived experience. And when we explore that, we begin to see why the saints and even the demons themselves teach us, through their victories and failures, the precise mechanics of sanctification. The journey from grace to sanctity is not simple, it is not painless, and it is not immediate. It is a deliberate, intense, ongoing confrontation with the forces that oppose holiness, a confrontation that God orchestrates with meticulous precision, using every trial, every temptation, and every act of virtue to shape us into excellence in grace. And this is only the beginning. The key to understanding how we attain holiness lies not only in knowing what sanctifying grace is, but in understanding how it increases in our daily lives. Every good deed we perform, provided we are in a state of grace and with a supernatural intention, increases our participation in the divine nature. This means that by performing morally good acts with the intention of pleasing God, our holiness grows. This is why saints like Padre Pio are considered examples of extraordinary holiness. Each of his acts, however small they may have seemed, was imbued with grace and virtue, and therefore his actions had a much greater impact than those of the average person. So why don't we all act perfectly, even in a state of grace? This is where spiritual warfare comes in. Although God grants us supernatural virtues, these can only operate fully when we overcome our natural deficiencies and vices. For example, we cannot practice temperance if we haven't cultivated habits that help us control ourselves. Demons, in their constant attack, not only exploit our weaknesses, but also seek to reinforce our flaws to prevent these higher virtues from manifesting. Thus, spiritual warfare compels us to grow in strength and moral wisdom, cultivating virtues that would otherwise remain dormant. The virtues, as theologians teach us, are divided into acquired and supernatural. Acquired virtues, such as prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance, have a natural end. They help us to live well and develop as human beings. Supernatural virtues, on the other hand, have God as their end. Charity, for example, is not only loving our neighbor, but loving God through our neighbor, acting for his glory and not for personal gain. It is this perspective that transforms our actions into true acts of holiness. But even with supernatural virtues, we are not automatically perfect saints. We must constantly work on our shortcomings so that the virtues can fully work within us. Every sin or failing strengthens the influence of demons, while every conscious act of virtue strengthens us. Thus, spiritual combat is not only an external struggle, but an internal process of purification and moral growth. Every temptation overcome, every voluntary act of virtue increases our grace and draws us closer to the perfection God desires for us. Demons, though powerful, are under God's absolute control. Even when they seem to harass or possess us, their influence is limited by divine providence. God allows us to face these trials, not to punish us, but to shape us and strengthen our holiness. Through the struggle against them, we learn justice, fortitude, and charity in ways that ordinary life could not offer. In every spiritual battle, we are instruments of divine justice, and at the same time, recipients of a grace that elevates us beyond our human nature. In short, spiritual warfare is not a punishment, but a path to holiness. Every challenge, every temptation, and every trial is an opportunity to increase our participation in the divine nature. Holiness is not a distant ideal. It is the result of constant growth in grace and virtue, guided by God even through the attacks of evil. Understanding this changes our perspective. We no longer see the struggle as an obstacle, but as the tool God uses to perfect us. And every victory, however small, brings us one step closer to Him. But how can we truly use this spiritual warfare to our advantage? The key lies in awareness and discipline. Every time we face temptation, it's not just about resisting, but about recognizing which inner flaw is being attacked. For example, if we feel anger in the face of injustice, it's not simply a matter of suppressing it. We must analyze why that anger arises, what pride or impatience lies behind it, and use that moment to cultivate patience and humility. In this way, every challenge becomes spiritual training, an opportunity to strengthen virtues that would otherwise remain dormant. Demons seek precisely the opposite, to make us act without conscience, to give in to our vicious habits, and to strengthen our weaknesses. But here lies the great paradox. Every attack can be transformed into a blessing. If we respond with prayer, sacrifice, and reflection, what seemed like an obstacle becomes a stepping stone to holiness. The saints weren't superheroes who never fell. They were people who learned to recognize the pattern of temptation and use it to grow in grace. Every small act of virtue in the face of difficulty multiplies its effect and drives the devil away from our lives. A clear example of this can be found in charity. Temptation often drives us to envy, complaining, or judging others. But if we respond with understanding and generosity, we not only resist demonic influence, but also increase our grace. Virtue becomes both a shield and a sword. It protects us and allows us to advance in the spiritual life. Therefore, even the smallest actions, done with a supernatural intention, have immense value in the face of the attacks of evil. Furthermore, we must remember that we are not alone in this struggle. Prayer, the sacraments, and spiritual direction are powerful weapons that strengthen our divine nature. Every confession, every Eucharist received with faith, every act of conscious prayer increases our capacity to resist and grow. Demons can only act where there is weakness, and grace strengthens those vulnerable areas. Thus, the combination of personal effort and divine help makes us true warriors in the spiritual war, capable of transforming temptation into holiness. Finally, patience and perseverance are essential. Spiritual warfare doesn't have a single decisive confrontation. It's an ongoing process. Each day presents us with new trials, and each trial is an opportunity to choose virtue over vice. The saints understood this. Their greatness lies not in avoiding the struggle, but in remaining faithful to God in the midst of it. And if we learn to see our difficulties from this perspective, we will discover that every demonic attack can be a gift in disguise, a means to increase our participation in the divine nature and draw us closer to holiness. So, what do we do with all this in our daily lives? The answer is simple, but it requires commitment to live with awareness of our soul and the grace we receive. Every action, however small, can be a step toward holiness or a fall into spiritual mediocrity. That is why we must examine our decisions, our words, and our thoughts, and ask ourselves, does this action draw me closer to God or further away from Him? Spiritual warfare is not just an abstract concept. It is a daily reality that manifests itself in how we face difficulties, how we treat others, and how we fight against our own shortcomings. The concrete practice of virtue is our most powerful weapon. Patience in the face of injustice, humility in the face of pride, charity in the face of envy, fortitude in the face of fear. All these virtues are built day by day, action by action. And every time we choose good, we strengthen our soul, increase our grace, and reduce the influence of evil in our lives. Even the most difficult moments can be transformed into opportunities for growth if we face them with faith and determination. Let us never forget that we are not alone. God, the saints, and the sacraments accompany us every step of the way. Prayer gives us strength, confession cleanses us, and the Eucharist unites us more intimately to the source of all holiness. And if at any time we feel weak or defeated, we can remember that every fall is also an opportunity to rise stronger, to purify our intentions, and to draw closer to excellence in grace. Finally, let us understand that holiness is not a distant destination reserved for a select few, but a path available to all who choose to walk it with faith and perseverance. Spiritual warfare, far from being a threat, is a means by which God molds us, strengthens us, and teaches us to participate in his divine nature. Every challenge, every temptation, and every struggle can be transformed into virtue, and every act of grace draws us closer to the fullness of holiness that God desires for us. So today, as we leave here, let us remember that true greatness lies not in avoiding struggle, but in embracing it courageously and using it as the fire that purifies our souls. Holiness is possible, and each of us has the capacity to attain it, one act of virtue at a time, one choice at a time, always guided by God's grace and the firm intention to live according to his will.